This is absolutely pathetic work." That was the exact phrase Carlton Vance sneered across the polished mahogany table on the 44th floor of the Vance Global Systems Tower in downtown Chicago. 24 senior vice presidents, board members, and corporate attorneys sat in heavy, suffocating silence as Carlton picked up my 200-page acquisition binder. He held it between his thumb and forefinger with an expression of intense disgust, as though the leather cover were dripping with toxic waste. The air conditioning hummed softly against the floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the misty lakefront, but inside the room, the atmosphere was freezing. Everyone knew what was coming. Carlton was wearing a $5,000 tailored charcoal suit with gold cuff links, his silver hair combed back perfectly. He enjoyed performing for an audience, especially when he could diminish a senior professional in front of junior staff. Then, with calculated slowness, designed for maximum public humiliation, Carlton Vance, a 55-year-old corporate tycoon who had built his reputation on aggressive takeovers, grabbed both sides of the $3,800,000 agreement and tore it clean down the spine. The sound of heavy binding and high-grade paper tearing echoed through the executive boardroom like a gunshot. He tossed the shredded halves into the centerpiece bowl of fresh fruit, rested his elbows heavily on the table, and leaned forward until his face was just inches from mine. He told me that after 22 years in enterprise logistics, I was clearly showing my age at 48. He claimed that I had grown soft, that I lacked the killer instinct required for high-stakes corporate deal-making, and that presenting a deal structured around ethics and long-term research was proof that I was not ready for the big leagues. My name is Dennis Miller. I am 48 years old, and for the past 8 years, I had served as the Senior Director of Corporate Acquisitions at Apex Logistics Solutions. Throughout my career, I had earned a reputation as the steady operator, the man who double-checked regulatory filings, read every line of fine print, and never lost his composure regardless of the crisis. In an industry driven by loud vanity and impulsive bets, my quiet discipline had always been my strongest asset. My father, who worked 35 years as a high school principal in Ohio, had taught me early in life that loud men are usually scared men, and that real strength never needs to raise its voice. I spent my early career working through the industrial yards of Cleveland and Detroit, managing freight movements across 14 Midwestern states. I had survived 5 major corporate restructurings, navigated complex union contract renewals, and managed crisis situations without ever raising my voice or slamming a door. I understood the psychology of corporate bullies intimately. They relied on speed, public embarrassment, and raw shock value to force their opponents into panicked, defensive outbursts. The moment you yell back, you surrender the high ground and validate their spectacle. Looking across the table at Carlton Vance, sitting in his custom suit, enjoying the silence of 24 intimidated executives, I felt no urge to yell, slam my fists, or stammer a defense. Instead, a cold, absolute clarity washed over me. When Carlton finished his little theatrical performance, expecting me to crumble or plead for another chance, I looked him directly in the eyes. I told him in a calm, steady voice that he was absolutely right, sir. The boardroom went completely motionless. Carlton blinked twice, his condescending smirk freezing as he was caught completely off guard by my immediate, unbothered compliance. The vice presidents looked at each other in bewilderment, expecting a shouting match or a desperate plea. Instead, I calmly gathered my fountain pen, placed my notepad inside my leather briefcase, buttoned my navy suit jacket, thanked the board members for their time, and walked out of the conference room with measured steps. I could hear the sudden buzz of whispered conversations erupting behind me as the heavy oak doors clicked shut. In the history of Vance Global Systems, nobody had ever walked out on Carlton Vance after being publicly eviscerated. But I was not walking away in defeat. I was walking out to execute a strategic dismantling that had been quietly prepared months before. Carlton Vance was estimated to be worth roughly $450 million on paper. He was regularly featured on the covers of major business magazines, served as a trustee for prestigious civic institutions, and cultivated an image of visionary corporate brilliance. However, Nobody attains that level of unbridled authority without leaving a trail of broken lives in their wake. My firm had spent the preceding 8 months negotiating an exclusive technology license with Dr. Evelyn Harper, a brilliant 42-year-old software architect. Evelyn had spent 6 years engineering a revolutionary predictive routing algorithm capable of optimizing complex interstate freight networks and reducing enterprise fuel consumption by 32%. Evelyn was not merely an entrepreneur seeking a quick corporate buyout. Her younger sister had been diagnosed with a severe neuromuscular condition, which motivated Evelyn to design the core system architecture specifically to ensure the reliable, zero-delay distribution of temperature-sensitive medical supplies to rural clinics. She wanted her life's work protected, deployed ethically, and shielded from corporate liquidation. The $3,800,000 agreement I had painstakingly drafted for Vance Global was structured specifically to safeguard Evelyn's intellectual property rights under Title 35 of the United States Code Section 271, while securing a guaranteed 7-year research grant for her engineering team. It contained rigorous compliance clauses, ensuring that her software would remain dedicated to medical supply priorities, and that Vance Global could not shelve the patent or sell it off to foreign conglomerates. However, Carlton had refused to read beyond the initial financial summary on page 1. He saw the upfront licensing figure, decided he could intimidate an independent inventor into surrendering full ownership, and chose to use the board meeting as a stage for his personal dominance. After leaving the building, I walked down to the subterranean parking garage, got into my sedan, and sat quietly for 40 minutes. I did not panic, nor did I shed a tear. Instead, I systematically reviewed the history of Carlton's predatory behavior over the past 2 decades. I thought about my former senior colleague, Samuel, who had been stripped of his accrued pension rights right before retirement after raising legitimate compliance concerns regarding offshore vendor payments. I thought about the dozens of small supply chain subcontractors who had been bankrupted by Vance Global's predatory litigation tactics. I turned the key in the ignition, adjusted my rearview mirror, and made an unwavering vow. Carlton Vance was going to discover precisely what happens when an experienced operator turns his full attention to justice. Sitting in my vehicle, I reflected on how easy it is for powerful men to mistake silence for submission. For 22 years, I had watched executives like Carlton operationally abuse their staff because nobody had the patience or the discipline to build an airtight evidentiary record. They relied on fast-paced intimidation, assuming their targets would react with immediate anger or retreat into ashamed silence. But real strategy is played on a long timeline. I opened my leather notebook, drew a clean timeline of Carlton's corporate vulnerabilities, and began detailing the exact statutory triggers that would bring his $450 million house of cards tumbling down to the ground. Every detail mattered. I documented the specific dates when Carlton had overridden internal risk management warnings, the exact names of corporate officers who had signed off on dubious financial filings, and the timeline of regulatory submissions that could be challenged under federal administrative law. My experience in supply chain architecture had taught me that complex systems do not collapse from single massive blows. They collapse when their foundational structural flaws are systematically exposed all at once. The following morning at 7 o'clock, I met Dr. Evelyn Harper at a quiet corner diner in Evanston, Illinois. The morning sun was just beginning to hit the red brick storefronts outside, and the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the corner booth where we sat. When I detailed the events of the boardroom meeting, Evelyn was neither shocked nor discouraged. She took a slow sip of her coffee, set her porcelain cup down, and revealed that 3 months prior, Carlton Vance had approached her privately at a technology summit in downtown Chicago. He had subtly threatened that if she did not surrender 51% of her patent equity directly to Vance Global for a fraction of its market value, he would use his political influence within regulatory oversight committees to delay her commercial safety certifications indefinitely. Evelyn's testimony confirmed that Carlton was not merely an arrogant executive. He was an active corporate extortionist who used federal regulatory channels as a personal weapon to hijack independent innovation. I explained to Evelyn that we were not going to file a standard civil breach of contract lawsuit. A conventional lawsuit would drag on for 5 years in state court, while Carlton used his multi-million-dollar legal retainer to exhaust her financial reserves. Instead, we were going to build an unassailable evidentiary file based on strict statutory enforcement, federal compliance mandates, and corporate governance laws. Over the next 14 days, I systematically assembled a dedicated task force composed of individuals who had been victimized by Vance Global. Each person brought a vital piece of the legal puzzle. First was Nora Montgomery, a 58-year-old former chief financial officer who had been forced out of Vance Global 3 years earlier after refusing to sign off on fraudulent asset valuations. Nora possessed meticulous personal records and maintained discreet, trustworthy contacts within Vance Global's internal auditing division. She knew where every hidden accounting ledger was buried. Nora had kept detailed personal audit workbooks, complete with date stamps and internal tracking numbers, documenting how Carlton personally ordered the artificial inflation of corporate asset valuations to secure bank loans. Second was Wesley Brooks, a 36-year-old senior systems architect who had spent 3 years building Vance Global's cloud data infrastructure before being abruptly terminated for alleged performance issues. In reality, Wesley had been fired 24 hours after demonstrating a proprietary data compression framework that Carlton subsequently patented under his own name. Wesley had preserved full diagnostic logs proving his original authorship and establishing clear evidence of willful intellectual property theft under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. Third was Julian Cross, a 44-year-old investigative journalist who had spent 2 years investigating corporate malfeasance across the Midwest. Julian had already compiled an extensive dossier on Vance Global's upcoming $900 million initial public offering, identifying severe inconsistencies between their public financial statements and actual operational debt. The most critical breakthrough, however, occurred through Nora's personal network. She arranged a confidential meeting with Claire Vance, Carlton's 50-year-old wife. Claire was widely known as a prominent philanthropist who managed a respected regional foundation for the arts. However, behind the polished public image lay a tragic personal reality. Meeting Claire in a private office in suburban Oak Park, she provided documented proof of 15 years of psychological control, financial coercion, and domestic abuse. Carlton had repeatedly warned her that if she ever attempted to file for divorce, he would use his legal apparatus to strip her foundation of its tax-exempt status and ensure she left the marriage with zero financial assets. She showed us fading wrist marks and presented handwritten notes where Carlton had tracked her daily movements. Claire had reached her breaking point. She informed us that Carlton routinely conducted high-level executive calls from his home study, openly discussing strategies to manipulate quarterly financial reports in order to artificially inflate company valuation metrics prior to the public offering. Crucially, Claire had preserved backup copies of internal financial spreadsheets, voice memos, and unredacted board correspondence that Carlton had carelessly saved on shared home storage drives. Examining these materials alongside Nora and Wesley, we uncovered evidence of massive legal violations. Vance Global was actively preparing to execute illegal mass layoffs of over 200 supply chain workers without providing the mandatory 60-day written notice required under Title 29 of the United States Code. Section 2101, known as the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. Furthermore, internal bank transfers confirmed that Carlton had engaged in a severe breach of fiduciary duty by diverting $12 million of corporate reserves into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. A clear case of dissipation of assets intended to deceive both public investors and his spouse prior to divorce proceedings. Our legal weapon was not emotional grievance. We had uncovered a systematic web of federal fraud, labor violations, and asset concealment that could completely dismantle his corporate empire if presented to federal enforcement agencies. Nora, Wesley, Julian and Claire, were not just allies. They were witnesses to a pattern of systemic corporate corruption that spanned over a decade. As we sat around the dining table in Nora's home, reviewing spreadsheets and diagnostic files until 3 o'clock in the morning, the picture became crystal clear. Carlton Vance was not invincible. He was sloppy. His arrogance had created a false sense of security, leading him to leave digital footprints, unencrypted voice recordings, and paper trails across multiple jurisdictions. We organized our evidentiary binders with extreme care, ensuring that every single allegation was backed by at least 2 independent forms of documentary proof before taking a single public action. We established a secure communication protocol using encrypted channels so that no internal Vance global security systems could detect our progress. Every piece of paper was scanned, verified by legal experts, and cross-referenced with federal regulatory databases to guarantee that our eventual submission would withstand the most rigorous judicial scrutiny. With all documentary evidence cataloged and verified, we initiated the third phase of our operation. Dr. Evelyn Harper contacted Carlton Vance directly, pretending that my abrupt departure from Apex Logistics had left her feeling vulnerable and uncertain about her commercial future. She signaled that she was willing to bypass Apex entirely and negotiate a direct licensing deal for her predictive routing technology, provided they met privately in his executive office suite. Carlton, driven by his insatiable desire to secure a technology valued at tens of millions of dollars before the upcoming public offering, took the bait immediately. He scheduled a private 2-hour meeting in his corner suite for Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Prior to the meeting, Wesley Brooks equipped Evelyn with a specialized military-grade digital recording device hidden inside a sleek executive fountain pen. The device recorded crystal-clear audio while simultaneously transmitting an encrypted wireless signal to a secure receiver installed in a mobile monitoring vehicle, parked 2 blocks away. Wesley gave Evelyn detailed instructions on how to steer the conversation naturally without alerting Carlton, ensuring that every key admission was stated clearly on tape. I sat inside the monitoring vehicle alongside Julian Cross, listening through high-definition noise-canceling headphones as the meeting commenced. The audio signal was pristine, capturing every ambient sound in Carlton's office, from the clinking of espresso cups to his confident footsteps across the carpet. For the first 45 minutes, Carlton deployed his full array of corporate charm. He poured Evelyn expensive espresso, offered her an impressive title, a lavish expense account, and promises of international media exposure. However, as soon as Evelyn raised specific questions regarding the preservation of her independent patent rights under Title 35 of the United States Code, Carlton's demeanor transformed into naked arrogance. He laughed patronizingly, informing her that once the contract was executed, Vance Global's corporate legal department would file amended patent paperwork establishing Carlton Vance as the primary co-inventor. He sneered that independent female developers operating without corporate backing possessed zero standing in federal courts, and that any attempt to challenge his ownership would result in immediate regulatory blacklisting that would ruin her professional standing permanently. When Evelyn explicitly asked why he had torn up my proposal 2 weeks earlier, Carlton's candid admission was captured in pristine audio clarity. He bragged openly that he had intentionally staged the public destruction of my contract to send a stern message to the entire board of directors that legacy managers over 45 years old were obsolete liabilities who needed to be purged. He admitted that he had personally telephoned chief executives across 3 states to ensure that Dennis Miller would be blacklisted from receiving executive appointments anywhere in the Midwest. He stated flatly that corporate leadership was defined by absolute dominance and that anyone who introduced ethical considerations into a boardroom deserved to be destroyed. Most damaging of all, Carlton began boastfully detailing the financial mechanics of Vance Global's upcoming $900 million initial public offering. He revealed to Evelyn that he had intentionally understated corporate operational liabilities by $40 million in preliminary disclosure documents submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission. He explained with chilling nonchalance that by the time federal auditors identified the accounting discrepancies 2 years post-IPO, he would have already liquidated his personal equity shares, resigned his chairmanship, and relocated to non-extradition jurisdictions in South America. Hearing those explicit admissions broadcast in real time was chilling. Carlton had unknowingly handed us unequivocal proof of criminal securities fraud, tortious interference with contractual relations, and willful intellectual property theft under Title 17 of the United States Code Section 106. When Evelyn concluded the meeting 20 minutes later and walked calmly to the elevator, she held the fountain pen firmly in her hand. We now possessed indisputable, unedited digital evidence of a chief executive officer detailing his own illegal operations. Inside the surveillance van, the tension was palpable as Julian monitored the signal strength while I took notes on every word spoken in that 44th floor suite. Hearing Carlton articulate his contempt for regulations, for female innovators, and for senior employees gave us precisely the qualitative evidence needed to prove willful intent under federal statutes. When a corporate executive openly boasts about hiding $40 million in liabilities from federal regulators, he eliminates any defense of accidental accounting oversight. We knew that once this audio was played before an independent board committee and federal prosecutors, no amount of corporate PR could save his career. Wesley immediately made 3 independent digital backups of the raw audio file, storing them on encrypted hardware drives located in separate secure facilities. We transcribed every spoken sentence verbatim, matching the timestamps with the unredacted accounting files provided by Nora and Claire to build a complete chronological narrative of fraud. That evening at 8 o'clock, our entire task force convened at a private legal conference room in downtown Chicago to coordinate the execution of our multi-pronged enforcement strategy. We were not interested in chaotic internet rumors or petty social media attacks. Every action was timed with mathematical precision to strike Carlton Vance simultaneously across legal, regulatory, banking, and public governance sectors. On Thursday morning at 6 o'clock sharp, Julian Cross published a comprehensive 20-page investigative report through a prestigious national financial publication. The report was backed by verified document scans, forensic accounting charts provided by Nora Montgomery, and exact transcript excerpts from the recorded meeting. Within minutes of publication, financial news networks began broadcasting live segments analyzing the exposé, causing immediate concern among market analysts. On Thursday morning at 7 o'clock, Nora and Wesley dispatched encrypted evidentiary archives directly to 3 pivotal institutional targets. The first package was delivered to the Division of Enforcement at the Securities and Exchange Commission, complete with internal ledgers, establishing the intentional $40 million liability omission. The second package was transmitted to the senior managing partners of the lead investment banking syndicate, tasked with underwriting the $900 million public offering. The third package was delivered directly to every independent member of Vance Global's board of directors. On Thursday morning at 8 o'clock, Claire Vance held a formal press conference at the Chicago Bar Association alongside her senior matrimonial counsel. She announced the establishment of a $10 million advocacy trust dedicated to supporting victims of corporate executive fraud and domestic coercion. While Claire maintained complete professional poise and refrained from personal attacks, her legal team simultaneously served Carlton Vance with formal divorce papers citing dissipation of assets and securing emergency temporary restraining orders backed by sworn affidavits detailing years of domestic abuse. By 9 o'clock in the morning, absolute turmoil had engulfed the corporate headquarters of Vance Global Systems. I arrived at the building wearing a dark navy suit, carrying my leather briefcase, and walked calmly through the grand marble lobby. The environment was chaotic. Administrative staff were rushing frantically between offices, desk phones were ringing without interruption, and security personnel stood paralyzed near the security turnstiles as lobby television monitors broadcast live national news coverage detailing the SEC investigation. I rode the glass elevator up to the 44th floor executive suite. The reception desk was abandoned as staff clustered around computer screens reading the published investigative report. Inside the main boardroom, an emergency meeting of the board of directors was collapsing into total panic. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, I observed 4 senior board members standing up, slamming their notebooks onto the conference table, and walking out of the room after reviewing the SEC enforcement notice on their mobile devices. Minutes later, the lead investment banking syndicate issued a formal press release announcing the immediate and indefinite cancellation of Vance Global's $900 million initial public offering. I walked past the empty secretarial stations, opened the heavy oak door to Carlton Vance's private corner office, took a seat in one of the high-backed leather armchairs facing his massive desk, rested my hands comfortably on my knees, and waited for his arrival. Waiting in Carlton's office during the height of the crisis was a deliberate tactical choice. In high-stakes corporate enforcement, the psychological impact of confronting a fallen tyrant at the precise moment his power vanishes is unmatched. As I sat in that quiet armchair, listening to the muffled commotion in the corridors outside, I felt an extraordinary sense of calmness. For 22 years, I had seen good people driven out of the industry by men who believed they were above the law. Now, watching the television monitors broadcast news of the SEC inquiry and the cancellation of the initial public offering, I knew that accountability had finally arrived. The silence inside his corner office was a sharp contrast to the panic outside. I took out my leather notebook, reviewed the final checklist of regulatory notices, and felt completely confident that every contingency had been accounted for in our filings. 45 minutes later, the heavy office door slammed open with violent force. Carlton Vance rushed into the room, his face pale and his collar unbuttoned as he screamed furiously into his mobile phone, ordering his senior legal counsel to file immediate federal injunctions against the news publishers. When he finally turned around and spotted me sitting comfortably in his armchair, his phone slipped slightly from his grip. He stared at me in absolute bewilderment before his face contorted into pure rage. He demanded to know how I had gained entry into his private office and threatened to have armed building security throw me onto the pavement outside. I remained comfortably seated, looked at him with complete composure, and calmly suggested that he check his desktop terminal before making any further rash decisions. He marched behind his desk, opened his computer terminal, and began scanning the incoming emergency alerts. As he read the formal enforcement notice from the Securities and Exchange Commission, the board resolution stripping him of executive authority, and the court order freezing his personal bank accounts under state asset protection statutes, the remaining color drained entirely from his face. He looked up at me, his hands trembling visibly against the polished edge of his mahogany desk. He spat venomously that I could never prove a single allegation in a court of law and that his legal team would tie me up in litigation until I was bankrupt. I looked at him calmly and cited the exact legal frameworks that secured his downfall. Under Title 17 of the United States Code Section 106 and Title 35, Section 271, the evidence of intentional patent infringement and trade secret theft was already logged with federal prosecutors. Furthermore, because he had attempted to enforce employment agreements containing forged compliance signatures, those contracts were declared legally void ab initio under state law provisions exposing him to personal liability. Carlton lunged forward across the desk, raising his fist and screaming that I had destroyed his life over a rejected contract. I stood up slowly, buttoned my suit jacket, and looked at him without a single trace of anger. I told him that his corporate empire had not collapsed because of a torn contract. It had collapsed because he believed that wealth granted him permanent immunity from ethical boundaries, federal law, and basic human dignity. I pointed calmly to the active security cameras in the corners of his ceiling, reminding him that his every action was being recorded live by corporate security and federal observers. Carlton froze, his hand dropping slowly to his side as he realized that his authority, his $450 million fortune, and his public standing had completely vanished. Minutes later, Two federal marshals and SEC compliance officers arrived at his office door to serve formal criminal subpoenas. That afternoon, the board of directors voted unanimously to terminate Carlton Vance for cause, stripping him of all severance pay, stock options, and executive privileges. 6 months later, Vance Global completed a thorough corporate restructuring under new ethical leadership. Dr. Evelyn Harper retained full ownership of her predictive algorithm and finalized a highly lucrative partnership with Apex Logistics, deploying her technology to optimize supply chains nationwide. Claire Vance successfully secured her financial independence and expanded her foundation to assist hundreds of individuals affected by executive misconduct. As for myself, I chose not to return to traditional corporate employment. Evelyn and I co-founded Vanguard Integrity Partners, a specialized consulting firm dedicated to assisting independent inventors in protecting their intellectual property against corporate overreach. At 48 years old, I realized that true professional success is not measured by the height of your office tower or the fear you project in a boardroom. It is measured by your unwavering integrity, your steady resilience, and your willingness to stand firm when arrogance demands your submission. The quiet that followed Carlton's arrest was profound. As the federal marshals escorted him through the executive glass doors and down the elevator, the remaining staff stood in stunned silence. There was no cheering or dramatic applause, only the quiet realization that an era of intimidation had come to an end. Over the next several weeks, as the full extent of the financial irregularities was audited, the board worked frantically to repair the damage. But for our team, the victory was not in the destruction of an arrogant man. It was in the protection of Evelyn's life work, the liberation of Claire from years of coercion, and the establishment of a safer environment for honest professionals across the industry. Looking back on the entire journey, I am reminded that corporate titles and vast fortunes are temporary, but character and truth endure. When faced with arrogance, quiet resolve will always overcome loud intimidation.